Hello, good morning. You're watching World News live from Warsaw. My name is Sasha Farbach. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff is set to meet with Volodymyr Zelenskyy and European leaders in Berlin this weekend. It's reported by the Wall Street Journal. Previously, it was Paris that was slated to host this meeting on Saturday, but those plans have reportedly been scrapped. Witkoff's European visit comes after the White House announced earlier this week that U.S. President Donald Trump would only send an official to Europe for talks on a peace deal in Ukraine if there were real chances of reaching an agreement. This week saw efforts to bring the war to an end intensify, with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy sending his own version of a peace proposal to his U.S. counterpart and hinting at Ukraine's possible territorial concessions as part of the peace deal. In Berlin, Witkoff and Zelenskyy will be joined by the leaders of France, UK, and Germany. A free economic zone in the Donbas region could work, said U.S. President Donald Trump. The idea of both Russia and Ukraine leaving the region to become a demilitarized zone where U.S. businesses could operate was put forward in a revised peace plan sent by Kyiv to Washington.
Thanks, Mr. President. Can you tell us how this free economic zone would work in the Donbas in land that the Russians took by force?
Well, I don't want to do that now. It's a very complex situation, but it would work, and a lot of people want to see it work. And all I want to do is I want to stop the death of 25,000 people a month.
The latest peace plan raises questions about the future of Ukraine's partially occupied Donbas territories. President Donald Trump's concept of a demilitarized free economic zone in the region must now be considered by Kyiv. Adding to the developments, the Financial Times reports a new element in the counterproposal being discussed that would guarantee Ukraine's EU accession by January 1st, 2027.
Though Ukrainians continue withstanding Russia's relentless attacks, their faces are starting to betray a level of resignation, particularly as the US continues to pressure Kyiv to yield to Russian demands on one of the two biggest unknowns of potential peace plans, Ukrainian territory.
Well, I think Kyiv is in a position where they have to navigate their relations with the Trump administration. They certainly don't want to be perceived in Washington and by Trump in particular as an obstacle to peace.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that the US has now proposed that the Ukrainian-controlled, heavily fortified Donbas region, where Russia makes inch-worthy territorial gains but has failed to capture, is to be set up as a demilitarized so-called free economic zone. But with Kremlin's insistence that Ukrainian troops withdraw, one key question remains.
President Zelenskyy said something that, okay, if there is a demilitarized zone from which we are supposed to withdraw our troops and Moscow is not supposed to move their troops in, then who's responsible for managing this piece of land? And says the Americans have not explained that yet. So I think that's an open question, but that certainly is a vulnerability for Ukraine.
But as Zelenskyy urges resilience at the front lines,
it is extremely important to achieve results on the front line so that Ukraine can achieve results in diplomacy. That's how it works. Our strong military positions within the country equal strong positions in talks about ending the war.
The US remains reserved in its potential commitments to Ukraine, while experts note that alternatives are limited.
The only country that could actually provide a Article 5 type guarantee is the US. The EU currently doesn't have the capacity to deliver the same amount of deterrence as the US is.
At the same time, the EU is throwing its towel into the ring, presenting Washington with a draft peace plan which envisages that Ukraine could join the bloc as early as January 2027.
It's the European leaders dangling this EU membership, this fast track to EU membership, as a sweetener for Zelenskyy and for the Ukrainian people to accept what President Stubb referred to as not necessarily just peace.
For his part, Zelenskyy is also willing to make a nod towards US demands, saying that territorial concessions are to be decided via a democratic vote. But, as the former US ambassador to Ukraine pointed out, constant shelling of Ukrainian cities makes the logistics of conducting referendums or elections tricky.
The election would be a form of referendum on any kind of a peace deal. However, It is, as you just pointed out, it's impossible to have an election, a referendum, while the Russians are bombing Ukrainian cities.
But while public support in Ukraine for territorial concessions has climbed to almost 40%, that does not appear to be the case for Ukrainian freedom fighters at the front lines.
We can't just leave parts of our territory. How could it be? Let's say my house is somewhere near Pokrovsk, Kramatorsk or Sloviansk. Should I just leave my parents, everything, and just go? I don't think so. Better to fight and be free than to be enslaved.
And as diplomatic pressure mounts on Ukraine to give in, experts remind current draft proposals are likely to only result in temporary peace.
Russia views this as a success. They will announce it as a success. And in case they see that as a success, I don't think that in like 5-10 years' time, anything would stop them to actually continue.
And as diplomacy becomes more complicated, the coalition of the willing is poised to meet again this weekend. The US's attendance, however, remains under a question mark. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
Continuous discussions on the use of frozen Russian assets seem to have ruffled feathers in Moscow, with Russia's central bank announcing it will sue the company retaining its assets in Brussels. This comes as the European Union agreed on Friday to indefinitely freeze Russian central bank assets held in Europe. Now, the question is if and how to use the money to fund a loan for Ukraine. Our correspondent, Alex Kadier, has the story.
Well, this lawsuit by the Russian Central Bank will be put forward in front of a court in Moscow. They are suing Euroclear, the clearinghouse that holds Russian sovereign assets frozen in the European Union following EU sanctions. Now, of course, that court in Moscow does not have jurisdiction over Euroclear, and European officials have been abundantly clear today, speaking behind the scenes, that all those European sanctions are completely compliant with European and international law, and therefore a Moscow court cannot adjudicate on this, and therefore are not being taken that seriously. It is seen by many Brussels officials as just a way of frustrating the process. That is what we heard from Valdis Dombrovskis, the economy commissioner.
We can expect that Russia will continue to launch speculative legal proceedings to prevent the EU from upholding international law and to pursue the legal obligation for Russia to compensate Ukraine for the damages it has caused.
So Brussels not taking this lawsuit all that seriously. What is serious, however, is the looming battle over the horizon, the European Council meeting of all 27 EU leaders here in Brussels. We had protesters outside of the European Council building in the last few hours calling for Belgium to make Russia pay, to release the funds to pay for a reparations loan to fund Ukraine over the next couple of years. The Belgian Prime Minister is still digging his heels in. He says he does not want to have his country shouldering any potential litigation or financial blowback alone. Nevertheless, many member states want this loan to go through. There is still a lot of pressure on Belgium. If a deal is not reached in the coming week, there may be serious concerns for Ukraine's funding over the next couple of years. In Brussels, I'm Alex Kadier for TVP World.
Their crime was refusing to spread Russian propaganda. Hundreds of Ukrainian journalists remain detained after being captured in occupied territories, as chilling accounts of mistreatment and outright torture continue to emerge. One such journalist, Dmytro, spoke about his captivity and the horrific crimes committed by Russia against independent media in a conversation with our reporter, Anastasia Yanchenko.
Hunger, total hunger, cold. They beat us with rubber batons. They used a stun gun on us.
That is how Dmytro, a former Russian prisoner, describes what Ukrainian journalists endure in Russian captivity. Dmytro spent 3 years in a Russian prison where he was taken in March 2022. In August 2025, he was released in a prisoner of war exchange between Russia and Ukraine. A brutal crackdown in Russia has made the country the world's leading jailer of foreign journalists. At the moment, 26 Ukrainian journalists remain in Russian captivity, held in complete incommunicado.
They don't have any access sometimes to lawyers. They don't have any access to any medical support. Some of them do not have any contact with their families, and the families do not know where they are located, where they are transferred. They can learn about transfer a couple of months after it happened.
All of these journalists were detained in Russian-occupied territories because they refused to spread Russian propaganda. They exposed what life under Russian occupation truly looks like. One of the most widely reported recent cases is that of 21-year-old Yana Suvorova, who was arrested in August 2023 at the age of 19 for administering a pro-Ukrainian Telegram group.
They kept her in a cell with people who had attempted suicide. They were preparing her for a strict regime right there in occupied Donetsk, and her emotional state really deteriorated from there.
Yana was sentenced to 14 years in prison. From Melitopol, she was transferred to Taganrog in Russia, a facility notorious for its horrific conditions. It is the same prison where Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina was killed.
She was healthy, young journalist, and the body was returned in horrible condition. She lost a lot of weight. The inner organs were removed. Russians were trying to cover the artificial way of how she died.
Roshina's case drew international attention, highlighting violations of the Geneva Conventions. The European Commission has already imposed sanctions on the prison officials responsible for the Ukrainian journalist's death. The number of crimes against journalists continues to grow each month. Since February 2022, 868 crimes against Ukrainian media workers have been recorded. During this time, 119 journalists have been killed, 15 while reporting, 14 others remain missing, and 29 have been kidnapped. To investigate these crimes and bring imprisoned journalists back home, the Ukrainian parliament has established a special investigative commission.
We want to tell more about how propaganda justifies both crimes against media, crimes against humanity, the genocidal intent of this war.
However, Dmytro, who survived 3 horrific years in Russian captivity, says that only applied pressure in Russia can bring freedom to those still in prison.
Everyone must speak out about them holding journalists in captivity. Every international platform must be reminded that they are violating international law and the Geneva Conventions by illegally detaining civilians, including journalists. We need to keep up the pressure so that they release them.
For TVP World, Anastasia Yanchenko.
Now for some business news. South Korean tire maker Coale is setting up shop in Poland. The industry's 16th most valuable company in the world will build a €500 million production facility in the country.
Another day, another investor in Poland. Coale Tire, a South Korean tire manufacturer, decided to open a new manufacturing site near Opole, southern Poland, creating around 400 jobs in the process.
This won't be a massive factory. It will be focused on the European rather than global market, but to be profitable it must be heavily automated. Poland is still a great place for manufacturing due to factors like location, low labor cost compared to other European countries, and generous support from special economic zones.
As part of the incentive package, Coale won't have to pay corporate income tax for 15 years. Coale joins other global players drawn to Poland, including Japanese Bridgestone and French Michelin. But Poland's competitive advantage for tire makers has been eroding, as evidenced by Michelin's decision to move some of its production from Olsztyn to Romania.
The future of the Polish tire industry depends on 2 things. Number 1, decreasing the cost of energy and a stable regulatory environment. Number 2, limiting unfair imports of cheaper tires from outside of the EU, which distorts the market.
The factory will produce 6 million tires annually, or 10% of Coale's current global output. This will be the company's first European site, even though it's generating a quarter of its revenue on the old continent.
And speaking of tires, let's also talk about cars. Warsaw ranks as the 8th most congested city in Europe, according to the Global Traffic Scoreboard. While the report measures the average time drivers spend stuck in traffic, it doesn't fully capture the everyday experience of local commuters. To bridge that gap, TVP World took to the streets of Warsaw to hear firsthand what residents have to say about getting around the Polish capital.
I mean, there's a great public transport system in the city here, beautiful, modern, silent running trams and stuff. So encouraging people to use less cars would make the air fresher and people happier.
I think that transport in the city is certainly developing these days, including typical means of public transport like city buses or the metro system. I believe it will be very useful and serve people well.
Eighth place isn't the top of the chart, but many of these cities are not as big as Warsaw. For a country's capital, I consider it a very good result.
And with that, we conclude World News here on TVPO, but stay tuned. There's much more coming up, so don't go away. Goodbye.